So it's a great honor to get to introduce Professor Michael Jordan from Berkeley as our first presenter. I could fill his entire slot talking about all the great things he's done, but I'm going to keep it short. Two things I looked up yesterday that really stand out. I think one of them is Mike by now is over 78,000 citations. Also, he has by now graduated 50 students who have gone on to take on faculty positions, including 4 here at Stanford. Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm proud of those 4 at Stanford. That's really quite something. People here have good taste. So I'm glad to be here. When I got the invitation from Peter and Marco, I said, you know I don't work on robotics, don't you? And they said, sure, we know that. It's okay. So I thought about it a little bit and I thought about what to talk about. It is kind of the era of big data and computation meets statistics and all kinds of themes are really, it's an exciting era. I decided to talk about the Bayesian work I'm doing. I sort of half the time I'm a Bayesian and half the time I'm a frequentist, go back and forth on a daily basis. The Bayesian stuff's growing, and I think it's going to eventually have a real important role to play. And I think robotics might be a bit of a killer app for it. I think it's a domain where it's very natural to be Bayesian. It's very natural to assume you have some priors, you know something. The robot has some priors. You have models, and you update them recursively. It just feels very much like a Bayesian paradigm has a big role to play. On everything, but a big role to play. The other part of my title, there's a bunch of buzzwords up there, but has the word nonparametrics in it, and I hope some of you have already been exposed to nonparametrics thinking. It doesn't mean no parameters, it means growing numbers of parameters. In principle, mathematically infinite numbers of parameters. They're random because we're being Bayesian, so you have infinite numbers of random variables that are all tied up in some way, and that's what a stochastic process is. So the field of Bayesian nonparametrics is basically statistical inference with stochastic process priors. That's what it is mathematically. And these priors that are used are very structured. They have combinatorial structure, they have algebraic structure, they have analytic structure, and so on. And so a lot of these structures, again, have a feel like something like what a robot would need. So that's the last 2 words in the title. The main one I'll focus on today is really actually scalability. So before kind of turning this over to an applied community which has got real data and real problems, one wants to start to worry about the scalability. And this has not been the focus of most Bayesian nonparametrics research. The researchers in the field, of which there are hundreds worldwide, have been mostly focused on the mathematics, the stochastic processes, and proving things about these objects, and not so much worried about the scalability. So that's what we're doing today. This is kind of a first talk that heads towards the scalability directions. There's a couple of parts to it. MAD-Bayes and SDA-Bayes. So let me get going. So just to kind of get some notation started, broad audience, not sure exactly what you know, but if you open up a Bayesian analysis textbook, you see Bayes' theorem at some point, page 2. It's usually written as something involving, let me find my red thing there, a little tiny green thing, you guys see that. So there's a likelihood here, which is given the state of nature theta, what's the probability of some observations, and then it's Bayesian, so the state of nature is given a probability distribution here, and the posterior is proportional to the product. So theta is typically thought of as a Euclidean parameter. It lives in a Euclidean space, i.e. a finite dimensional space, and moreover that dimensionality doesn't change as you get more data. Okay, and the whole point of nonparametrics is that's no good. As we get more data, we expect to have a richer space. The state of nature can allow it to get more complicated as we collect more data. And think about kind of lifelong setting where the state of nature gets arbitrarily complex. You want the statistical model to accommodate that and not have to sort of have a fixed dimensional statistical model. So to make that transparent mathematically, instead of writing theta, you write g. That's our standard object here. This is now not a Euclidean vector. It's something that lives in an n-dimensional space, maybe a function space, maybe a space of trees, something. I'll give examples. Conditional on one of those objects, you have a classical likelihood, which is, if this is a tree, this might be a mutation process down the tree or some other probabilistic structure. This is something you can study at an undergrad level. This is the more complicated object. You have to put a probability on that space. This is a stochastic process. So we have a stochastic process prior times a rather simple likelihood, gives you a stochastic process posterior, and the update process needs to be efficient, and this needs to be a rich language that you could use in practical problems. So that's kind of mathematically what we need to try to do. So what kind of stochastic processes have been studied? So this is, now 40 years, I'd say, of research. There's stochastic processes on all kinds of things, directed trees of unbounded depth and fan out, partitions, grammars, features, Markov processes with unbounded state spaces. It's particularly relevant to you guys. This is a domain where you can talk about Kalman filters or hidden Markov models where you don't know the number of states a priori. And that typically grows as you get more dimensions, more data. So very natural for problems I think you'll be interested in. Priors on functions, on copula, and distributions on distributions. So you get a very recursive kind of formalism here that gives you distributions on distributions. Okay, so what about scalability? So this is to me, the current research problem for all of us who work in this area. MCMC has been the go-to tool by statisticians. You write down your model and you say, well, I can do Gibbs sampling, or I could do something else. There are real-world problems that have been solved with these tools, but they're too slow for most real-world applications that I think you guys have in mind. Then there's variational methods, and they're also just too slow, I think, slow, basically. So here's some of the projects that I'm going to allude to that are attempting to get beyond the scalability bottlenecks that we have with our classical methods. The first one I'll spend probably most of my time on is called Bayes. It has to do with something called small variance asymptotics, and then turns it into an optimization problem. So normally Bayesian analysis is integration. The frequentists sometimes integrate, but mostly take derivatives and set to zero. This is a optimization-based approach to Bayesian analysis, so very non-traditional in that sense. Then there are a couple other projects I just want to mention that one of them is my colleague Dave Bly and colleagues, Hoffman, Bly, Paisley, and Wang, where they're also going to optimization, in particular everybody's favorite tool, stochastic gradient descent, and applying it to a posterior distribution. So they're doing it, optimization again in a Bayesian setting. And this has allowed topic models to be scaled to sort of millions and tens of millions of documents, which was, a few years ago, not feasible. We followed that up at Berkeley with a project that built on SVI and did it in a different way. And hopefully we'll have time near the end of the talk to spend a little time on this. This is a streaming, distributed, asynchronous version of Bayesian analysis. So again, I think very appropriate for probably your settings. Okay, so that's kind of the big picture. Let's talk about this first part. Bayes, Tamara Broderick and Brian Kulis have been my collaborators on this. So what does MAD stand for? Well, MAP, I hope you know what that means. That's maximum a posteriori. So these are asymptotic derivations from Bayes, and the joke of the title is it would make Bayes mad because it's not really Bayesian. Okay, so let's try to bring Bayesian nonparametrics into contact with optimization. That's kind of the goal of this part of the talk. Okay, so, what's good about Bayesian nonparametrics? Well, it's really flexible. You can write models down, you can build hierarchies, you can have pieces of models talk to others. It's a toolbox, deluxe. And out of that toolbox, at the end of the day, you get some kind of a functional posterior, which usually you would try to integrate with. All right? But you don't have to integrate with it. You can manipulate it and maybe optimize with it. Okay? And so it's a really nice toolbox to generate all kinds of interesting optimization functionals that you could then treat in various ways. And I find that liberating. Often optimization community is a little bit of a loss. Think of what functional to optimize. And they go to least squares, or they go to L1, or they go to composite losses. But it's sort of, where do those things come from? They came from famous people in the past. That's really usually the answer. So we want a toolbox that allows us to generate interesting functionals that reflect real-world problems. And that's what Bayesian analysis is really good at doing. So that's the goal. Now, the inspiration for this talk is this right here, that if you think about the k-means algorithm, if there's not that's a very scalable algorithm. It's a clustering procedure that scales. It's 40 years old, but still widely used in industry. It has local optima problems and so on and so forth, but it really works for lots of problems, okay? And I think many of us know that it can be derived from a probabilistic point of view as a limit of an EM algorithm for fitting a mixture model. So that's kind of a well-known but not particularly useful connection that's around in the literature. And we're going to try to make that more useful. We're going to take this same sort of idea and apply that to a whole bunch of Bayesian nonparametric models, taking limits of them in some sense, and sort of see what new optimization procedures we get out by doing that. That's the goal. Okay, so the talk's not that long. I don't have time to give the whole lecture on Bayesian nonparametrics, so I'm going to kind of wave my hands at this point. I am writing a tutorial paper with Yi Tay, my colleague. It's over 150 pages already, and it'll hopefully be finished before it gets to 200, but this fall we hope to finish that, and it's a very readable version of this set of ideas. Let me just try on one slide to say what a Dirichlet process mixture model is. So what these stochastic processes are, they're typically discrete. That's what gives them the combinatorial structure. So they can be generally viewed as from an underlying Poisson process, which gives you some discreteness and some combinatorial structure. You generate what's called a Poisson random measure. A random measure is just a measure on a space. This is going to be discrete, so it has a whole bunch of atoms. And it'll be random, so it'll reflect some of your knowledge and uncertainty. All right, so the underlying objects are random measures, and then you use those random measures to generate, you sample from them, you draw atoms, and use them as parameters in more classical statistical likelihoods. Okay, so this picture sort of alludes to some of that process. Here's an example from a draw of a random measure on a one-dimensional space. Now our spaces are rarely one-dimensional, but for the picture, we have one dimension here. So these are atoms, i.e. they're masses of a certain size located at particular locations. The total mass for this particular object called the Dirichlet process is 1. So this is a random probability measure. And its randomness comes about, basically there's a source of atoms called G0, and there's a procedure in this particular case for a Dirichlet process, it's called stick breaking, that has a single scalar parameter alpha that generates in some sense the heights of all of these atoms. Okay? So I drew once and I got that little diagram. If I were to do it again and get a different G, I'd get a related diagram that also kind of peaks around the underlying source of atoms, and then it has a different kind of particular spread. That object, the way it's constructed, has a number of interesting combinatorial properties. In particular, its marginal probabilities are something known as the Chinese restaurant process. There are various earn models that flow out of this. There's a whole bunch of theory and probability theory that you can do just by saying, given the Dirichlet process, the marginals are this, and my theorem follows in a couple of steps. So here's the kind of the prior part of a model. You generate one of these objects. Now you have a whole bunch of atoms that you can use for a classical likelihood. Here in this particular case, I did a mixture model, meaning that I picked a parameter from my underlying bag of parameters, my atoms here. So maybe I picked this one here. And then I treated that as a parameter to a classical distribution of some kind, say a Gaussian, and that's the location parameter, the mean of the Gaussian. All right, and then I generated a data point from that distribution, finally at the bottom of my hierarchy, and I got a particular data point all the way at the bottom. Then this box suggests that I'm going to then pick a second theta, again from my bag of atoms, and then maybe it'll be the same theta, because this is discrete, I can get the same theta several times. Or it may be a different theta, and then I get an X sample from a different distribution that had a different underlying parameter. So there's a clustering structure just because you have a discrete set of atoms here, and you can select the same atom multiple times. When you do that, the corresponding data point is said to belong to the same cluster. Okay? We have an infinite number of atoms here, so we have an infinite number of potential clusters. The heights of these atoms drops off in an exponential way, so if you keep sampling this object, you'll see a certain number of atoms, and you'll see slowly more and more atoms. The rate at which you see atoms emerging goes as logarithmic. So log n, as n is the number of data points. So you're already seeing from this object a little bit of this nonparametric flavor, where as you get more observations, you see more of the underlying structure. Okay, so that's one, those are three pictures on that slide. Kind of here's the one I've been talking about or alluding to. Here's the graphical model representation of this as random variables, where some of the random variables in the graph are actually infinite valued. They're stochastic processes. So then some would say, well, it's formally, this is graphical models meet stochastic processes. And then down here is the way we publish it in the statistics papers. We just say that G is drawn from a Dirichlet process, that's this. Given G, the parameters are drawn from G, that's this line. And then given the parameters, we draw X from just a classical distribution of some kind. Okay, so hopefully that's enough structure for you, if you've not seen this material before, to have some intuition about the kind of models we're talking about here. They have these complicated underlying priors, and then eventually you get down to simple likelihoods. Here's just an example of generating data from that object. Here I took the F object to be a Gaussian, so the X is coming from a Gaussian with a parameter phi k, where phi k has got two parts to it, a mean and a covariance matrix. They're sampled from G0, which in this case was a normal inverse Wishart, a classical prior. And so now you sort of see after a few data points are generated, that's the blue dots, a few of those atoms have been selected. Those atoms are Gaussians now, and so those are the ellipsoids. And so we've had a few atoms be selected and corresponding data points have been generated. And then more data points are being generated down here. A lot of data has been generated, and you see more Gaussians have been used to generate that data. We see kind of a clumpiness where there's a few big clusters and then a whole bunch of other smaller clusters. And so that's the generative model, if you will, of data for in 2 dimensions in this case. If you continue to do this for a while, you will see the number of ellipsoids growing at rate log n, and you will see just more and more clusters slowly emerging as you do this. Now the inference problem, where the scalability comes in, is not that at all. It's in the inverse problem, which is that erase the ellipsoids, just give you the blue dots, and you're supposed to restore the ellipsoids. That's inference. Okay, so we want to be able to do that efficiently. And that's typically done with Markov chain Monte Carlo. We try out some ellipsoids and see how they're fitting and keep adding and subtracting ellipsoids and doing it in a Gibbs sampling style so that it provably is correct but too slow for practice. Here's been our biggest success story so far with this, and I put this up because there's a little bit of a robotics flavor, some kinematics here. This is the backbone of a protein. You know, proteins are strings of amino acids. Here's one amino acid, and here's a neighboring amino acid. And you can do the kinematics of proteins by putting a plane through the nitrogen, carbon, carbon, oxygen for each amino acid. That's one plane. Here's the next plane. And then you get the dihedral angles between these 2 planes, phi and psi. So you just need 2 numbers to talk about how one amino acid is oriented with respect to the other, and then you keep doing that across the entire chain. You have the whole backbone, the whole kinematics of a protein. So here's a whole bunch of those phi, psi angles for alanine, a particular amino acid, in a whole bunch of different proteins. So you see data that looks very much like what I showed you in the previous plot. There's kind of a few big clusters and a few smaller clusters, and it's sort of, as you see more and more data from the protein data bank, you see clusters slowly emerging. It really is a perfect fit for this. However, when we fit this data to the Dirichlet process mixture, it worked a little better, but not hugely better than the best thing they had been doing in the protein folding literature up until that point. You know, enough to publish a paper, but not enough to really say much, you know, about it. But here's the interesting part, which is that those things are too smudged out. This is alanine in all possible contexts, meaning what's on the left of you and what's on the right. Well, what's on the left and what's on the right has chemical effects on you. It pushes you and pulls you in various directions. And so your context tells you, shifts the angles that are allowed, the low energy angles for a particular amino acid. So to make a better statistical model of this, you want to stratify. You want to say, well, in my neighborhoods, of which there are, say, 400, if I take left neighbor and right neighbor, there's 20 amino acids in life, 20 on the left, 20 on the right, that gives me 400 neighborhoods. Break that plot down into 400 different plots according to the neighborhoods. Now those smudged out regions here will get a lot sharper because you're having your context specific now. Okay? Now if you build Dirichlet process fit them to that, you will do really, really well on some of those plots because it's just a better, more sharply tuned data. The problem is that some of the plots have now very, very little data. And so you'll do worse. Overall, you don't do much better. All right, so this is a classical statistical dilemma. You kind of lump everything together to get the full power of statistics, but you smudge things out too much. You lose precision. Or do you stratify everything and do really well in some cases, but bad in some other cases, and the overall average is not so good? All right, and this is where it is useful to be a Bayesian. The Bayesian doesn't have to pick one of those 2 extremes. The Bayesian says split them apart, that's the right thing to do, but build a hierarchical model where the parts still all talk to each other. All right, and so if in one of the plots some clusters are emerging because the data is telling you that they should, that transfers over to some of the other plots and it puts clusters there as part of the prior. All right, so long story short, if you build a hierarchy, and I'll take a little bit more about hierarchies later, in this particular case. All right, here's an example of some of the densities that you actually get out when you model these kinematic data. So this is alanine in the context of serine on the right. So we only did right neighbors here. And you see it's pretty, less data and a little sharper, and this is the density output by these models, and it's doing pretty well. Here's a couple little bumps here where there's no data. All right, and you would think, well, we've overfit. Tip on your frequentist hat, that's overfitting. Make the bandwidth bigger, that's a bad idea. But what happened actually is that alanine in the context of tryptophan, there was actually a little bit of data here and here. So this suggests that alanine in the context of serine, you just didn't get enough data. You didn't see the data yet. You better hedge your bets and put a little probability mass there. And the hierarchical Bayesian paradigm does that naturally. That's its great virtue, is that it takes information wherever it gets it and does fusion. It brings that information together to other parts of the model. So it's putting a little bit of mass here, even though there's no support for it in that particular data set, because in a different related data set, there's support. When you do that, there, in fact, if you're on your holdout set, there was a little bit of data there. And it predicted it well, and it got a boost. And so if you actually plot the boost you get over all the 20 amino acids of life, this is log probability on a test set, you see, and 0 is the best current performing model that they were using in that era in protein folding. We had massive improvements over all of these using this hierarchical approach. So this is a bit of a killer app for this set of applications. Let me mention 2 other applications just to give you a flavor. These are techniques that are being used in real life problems. This is work with Emily Fox at University of Washington. She visited me at Berkeley when she was a grad student, and this was a summer project. So speaker diarization is that you have a microphone in the middle of the room, a whole bunch of people in the room, you don't know who they are, you don't know how many people there are, and they're having a conversation. And the game is to take the waveform, just voltage across time, and segment it into, well, Bob was speaking for a while, then John, then Jill, then Bob. And you don't know their names, of course, but you do also want to infer that whoever was speaking here is the same person who was speaking here. Okay, so this is not just, sometimes this has often been attacked as a change point detection problem, find changes in a signal, but it's really more of a state model, a Markovian model, where you create a state for Bob, so then the next time Bob starts speaking, that state's ready to go to model Bob again and say, speak up. Oh, I think that's Bob. Right, and it's more data accrues, you can have more states. And so this is a very clearly non-parametric hidden Markov model setting, and we fit that kind of model using Dirichlet processes for this setting, and that year we had the best results on this, on the NIST challenge data set for that problem. Here's another problem. Again, Emily visited the next summer and worked on this problem. This is motion capture analysis. This is the CMU data set. And I think this, if I can press the button here. Anyway, I think this is motion capture. So there is actually real motion. This person does jumping jacks for a little while. Then they do touch your toes, and they do whatever else. For little segments, they do a particular exercise routine. And they switch to something else and something else. And now there are many people doing this, not just one person, and you get all this big data. What you're capturing is, I think, about 60 degrees of freedom. There's 20 motion capture sensors, each of which has 3 degrees of freedom, so about 60 dimensions. So you have a 60-dimensional time series that is segmentable. All right? But again, the segments are meaningful, and you don't know them a priori, and you don't know how many segments there are. All right? So if I learn eventually that touch your toes is a particular routine, then my model fits that. And that's used for my data. When Peter comes in the room and he actually does touch your toes, there should be a state ready to go to say, hey, I've seen that before. That's the touch your toes routine, and transfer information. So again, hierarchical modeling was critical to get good results here. And the non-parametric nature was that you don't know how many exercise routines there are. You don't know when they stop and start. You don't know who uses which routine. Okay, so the underlying machinery here was not the Dirichlet process. It was another object called the beta process, which has to do with feature modeling. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the difference between clustering and feature modeling later. But this situation, it's where you don't know the features to describe. And here the features are who uses which exercise routines. So my features are that I pick touch your toes and jumping jacks, and Peter's features that he picks, touch your toes and twists and something else. So we all have a little bit vector saying which of the underlying library we're picking. And the beta process is very appropriate for modeling that kind of situation. All right, so there you go. That's the kind of little bit of the examples of things these are used for. I was trying to just give you a little flavor of the non-parametric nature, the uncertainty, and the use of hierarchies. Okay, so let's now go into more of the point of this talk, which is that how do you actually scale? How do you fit these algorithms to real data? Okay, so let's go back to the Dirichlet process mixture model. Hopefully it became kind of clear as I was discussing it that it's an infinite mixture model. It's a mixture model where you have an infinite number of components, and those components decay in a particular way. So think about inference for this. So people have done this for about now 30 years. There's been every possible thing you could imagine: particle filters, SMC, Gibbs, Metropolis Hastings, and all kinds of special procedures. Right now, strange enough, even though this is a clustering problem, no one's ever actually thought about k-means. Is there a version of k-means that's appropriate for this setting? Okay, so just to remind you what k-means is, because I want to be concrete, I want to be really clear on this. So what is k-means? We have these data points, and we have clusters there's k of them. And let's represent the clusters with a prototype which lives in the same space as the data. You have allocations, ZIK, which are 0, 1s, saying which data point, for each data point, which cluster it's assigned to, okay? So this is a clustering situation, so for every I, only one of the K's is ZIKs is equal to 1, the others are equal to 0. So each row of this matrix has 1, 1, and all zeros. There's your allocation matrix. All right, now this is known to optimize a particular functional. The allocations pick out which of the centroids you're close, or prototypes you're close to, and you take the discrepancy between a data point and its corresponding centroid, add them all up over all centroids and over all data points, and get an overall functional. And k-means is coordinate descent on that functional. That's one way to conceive of k-means. All right, and here's the actual coordinate descent procedure. It takes the current fixed values of mu, finds the nearest centroid, and then that sets the allocation variables. And then the coordinate step for the z's is, for the mu's, is that given the allocation variables, just do weighted means to get the new values of the centroids. Okay, so hopefully you've all seen that. Okay, so you can get that algorithm that was slightly ad hoc. We just wrote down a functional of some kind. Slightly less ad hoc might be, you say, well, let's start with a Gaussian mixture model. The probability of a data point, given some means and some variances and some prior cluster weights, is you pick from that prior a cluster, and then you pick from a Gaussian with a certain mean and a spherical covariance. Okay, you sum that up over the clusters to get a mixture model. You take the product over the number of data points. So now let's set these pi's, let's get rid of them. Let's set them to 1 over k. Okay, write down an EM algorithm for fitting this model. An EM algorithm would update the mu's and the sigmas. Okay, now take sigma to 0. Take your spheres and make them small. All right, that's going to give you a hard assignment to the data points. Instead of giving a soft assignment, you get in a regular mixture model. So you get a hard assignment, and in fact, if you do that, you will recover the k-means algorithm, okay? The E step will allocate, and the M step will move the centroids around. So that's hopefully known to most of you. All right, so what if k is now not known? So this is still, to this day, a challenging problem. The literature is just not clear on what you should do when k is not known. And that's where we come in, because we have ways, the whole point of the Dirichlet process is that you don't have to fix k. There's an infinite number of atoms, and they arrive at rate log n. And the posterior will then tell you how many atoms in the posterior seem to be used. Okay, so instead of just keeping those two literatures completely separate, let's merge them. So let's take the Bayesian nonparametric machinery and write down the analog of that object right there. Okay, that's a thing where k has been burned in and it's a finite mixture model. Let's write down the probability analog of that from the Dirichlet process. It'll have a scale parameter in it, because there's these still Gaussians, there's just an infinite number of them. And take those Gaussian scale parameters to 0 and see what that functional becomes, and if you can optimize it. So that's the game. We're going to start with Dirichlet process mixture models instead of finite mixture models. Okay, so to do this, you need actually to study this. So over here I had these z variables, okay? Here they are, and appearing in these various formulas, these allocations. So here the z's are more complicated because there's an infinite collection of things. And so what you really are talking about is probability distributions on partitions. And the partitions are of arbitrary size. Right? So there needs to be a formula so you can take something to 0. And that formula is very famous. It has to do with what's called the Ewing sampling formula in genetics. And it is called, has another name, the EPPF, exchangeable probability partition function. Here it is, and now I'm getting into more symbols than I want to explain, but the probability of a partition, here we have the integers 1 through n. A partition of the integers 1 through n is a set of subsets. So C1 is a subset of the integers, maybe 2, 3, and 5. C2 would be 7, 6, and 45. And these are non-overlapping, exhaustive subsets of the integers 1 through n. Okay, that defines a partition. The probability that the Dirichlet process assigns to a partition, i.e. which cluster does each data point belong to, that defines a partition, has a formula. And it has to do with the alpha parameter, which I didn't discuss much, but it has to do with the probability of starting a new cluster, picking in a cluster that no one else has picked before. If there are k clusters in your final solution, that's going to have happened k times to get this expression. There's an ascending factorial down here, and then there's a product over each one of the clusters, and you take their cardinality. So there's a little formula that's kind of fun to think about how it arises, and it's very important. So that gives you a probability distribution on actually the allocation variables now, where we don't have an upper bound on the number of things that we're allocating. Okay? Right? Now you put that together with the rest of the likelihood, like in a classical mixture model, you just have now an open-ended number of components, but given the particular partition, you have a classical mixture model. Okay, so you can do all that. You write down a probability of the data, a probability of these allocations, which we've now encoded as a partition, and a probability of the underlying means, and you've taken these sigma squared in the underlying Gaussians to 0. So you write down this joint probability, and here's how the actual sigma goes to 0. So we're going to take sigma squared to 0 in this joint, in this overall probability. And in the Dirichlet process, we had that parameter alpha. Well, we have to scale alpha with sigma squared, and here is, it turns out, the right way to do this to get an interesting asymptotics. You put it in the denominator here of a negative exponential. All right, so now we've tied alpha naught to sigma, and we can take sigma to 0. Alpha naught, therefore, will go to 0 also at a certain rate. After you do all that, the total joint log probability, the posterior, what you get the posterior from, what the Bayesian cares about, has a formula. It looks like this, and it is exactly the k-means thing right here with a penalty term. All right, now we didn't put in this penalty term ad hoc. It came out from the underlying probability model. And notice that k appears now in two places. It appears here, and it appears here. All right, and we're not setting k, we're optimizing over k. It's part of our coordinate descent. We're going to now do coordinate descent on k and on the mu parameters. Okay? Well, from this term, if I let k be large, I'll get smaller value of the least squares. All right? It wants k to be large, but this term, of course, wants k to be small. Okay, so there's going to be a trade-off among these two things. When you're doing the coordinate descent, k will move up and down depending on how good the fit is and what the value of k is. Okay, so there's a new formulation of a k-means problem. We call this DP means, where you're doing k-means, but you're letting k vary in a particular way. Okay. Now, could you have thought about that in the k-means literature all by itself? Probably you could, and I do believe that it wasn't this is what widely discussed as an algorithm, but you see some papers where it's hinted at. Okay. But the whole point is this was just the first thing we tried. This is just classical DP mixtures, which are 40 years old. Let's take some other Bayesian nonparametric models and do the same thing and see what new procedures we get out that can fit all kinds of other data. They're not just clustering problems where you don't know the number of clusters. And that was our agenda then, once we realized we could do this. But let me just say a little bit more about this problem. What is the actual coordinate descent algorithm you get out? Here it is. So this is something that you can try instead of k-means. I think this is better than k-means. So what you do is you have a whole bunch of data points, and you take a data point and you assign it to the nearest cluster if the nearest cluster is within a threshold lambda. If there is no cluster within a threshold lambda of you start a new cluster at where you are. That's the algorithm. Couldn't be more simple. And it provably goes uphill until it, in this particular objective function. Okay. Moreover, we can now go back to fit a Gibbs sampler to the Dirichlet process as a comparison. Okay, it's a bit of an apples and orange comparison, but we did this. We implemented DP means on a particular on a data set, a vision data set. We had 312,000 image patches, which are 128 dimensional, so kind of a mid-scale precise problem. The runtime per iteration, just one iteration of Gibbs and DP means was 29 seconds versus 37, so they're roughly comparable for one iteration. But it's entirely infeasible to run Gibbs on this data set. The number of iterations needed is entirely infeasible. Whereas in this case, for our algorithm, it converged in about half an hour. Okay. All right, so let me move on. I want to say a little bit about multiple estimation problems. We've been talking about one kind of clustering problem or one estimation problem. What if we have multiple clustering problems? All right, so that's a problem that I haven't seen in the clustering literature. What if I have a data set that I want to cluster, and over here's another related data set I want to cluster, and here's another one, and here's another one. Like in my contexts, I might have multiple contexts, and the data sets all should use some of the same clusters, but they should allow it to be individualistic as well. Okay, so you could formulate that in the clustering literature, but I've just never seen it be formulated. It just didn't occur to people, I think. Okay, so you could try to formulate it, but now it's also going to be complicated. How do you share the clusters among the multiple k-means? And how do I set k? It should be different for each one of my clustering problems. And how do I rate all those values of k? So that starts to feel ad hoc and complicated. Okay, so for us, it's not hard at all. All we do is we build a hierarchy. We relate our multiple estimation problems by an underlying, all of our underlying parameters are gotten from a mother underlying parameter. And we then just do the same mathematics we've been doing on the other machinery. So I'm going to have to sort of, again, go quickly here to not get into details. But if we take our original DP mixture, which we had here, each one of them had an underlying random measure. We're going to have now multiple of them indexed with I. And we assume that each one of those random measures comes from an underlying random measure, which ties everything together. And that's called a hierarchical Dirichlet process mixture. And there's the specification in 3 different formats. So that allows you now to solve, in a Bayesian way, multiple clustering problems. But again, what about scalability? Well, can you run Gibbs sampler on this? Yes, you can. How slow will it be? Very slow. It'll take hours to days, depending on whatever the scale your problem is. So what we said is, let's just take the same machinery we just described here, write down the joint probability. It'll have a scale parameter in it. Take that scale parameter to 0. Get out an optimization functional that you can optimize with coordinate descent and run it on real data and see what happens. So here is the optimization functional you get when you do all that. It has a fit term. Each data point wants to belong to a particular cluster centroid. We now have multiple M indexes to different groups of clustering problems, and everything else is the same as before. And now we have 2 kinds of penalties. So basically here the story is that I'm a data point. I look and see if there's a cluster close to me. All right? If there's a cluster close to me, I assign myself to that. If there's not, I'm going to go up to a bag of clusters for all problems, and I'm going to pick one of those clusters up there. Okay? So that cluster might have been created in a different problem. And I'll bring that down and use that in my group. Right? If I go up there and there's no cluster within M of me, the M is a different parameter, I'm going to create a brand new global cluster for everybody to use. And then other groups get to use it too. So there's your algorithm. It's coordinate descent now in K and M, oops, I went ahead here, and the fit. So it's going to decide how many global clusters to use and how many local clusters to use as part of an overall coordinate descent. Okay. So I hope you view that as, as relatively elegant. It has some provable properties. It's a clustering algorithm that no one had described before, and it came pretty naturally out of this framework. Okay, so I've got like 5 minutes left. I'm going to kick into overdrive to now briefly say something about the beta process and then try to conclude. So the Dirichlet process is for clustering problems, where each entity in some way is assigned to one underlying entity. So, hidden Markov models. Every observation is assigned, you're in one state. You can't be in multiple states simultaneously. Clusterings, you're assigned to one cluster and so on. What if you don't like that? What if you want to have a situation where every data point can be assigned to multiple underlying states? There's a kind of a configuration of states that allow you to give probability to a data point. I have a bit vector for me and a bit vector for Peter, and they may overlap. That gives us a topology on me and Peter. How much overlap do we have in the underlying state assignments? So clustering models don't do that. There's another stochastic process which does. It's called the beta process, and we're working a lot on that one recently. It basically, instead of giving you a single coin that has an infinite number of possibilities that you toss and you get one outcome, it gives you a whole collection, an infinite collection of coins that you toss all simultaneously, and some of them come up heads and most of them come up tails. So you get a sequence of some ones and mostly zeros. You get a bit vector. Okay, so it's a way to give you an underlying set of probabilities for a bit vector that you can put together with all the rest of the machinery that I've been talking about. Here's an example of drawing from a beta process. Here's from 0 to 1. Here's all the atoms. And here's the coin tossing probabilities associated with each atom. So it's very sparse. This gives you sparse structures. And you mostly get zeros but a few ones. And then if you toss the coins, you get some ones and zeros, which are given by this pattern here. So the vertical bands here are places where you got a feature appearing a lot. And the places where there's no things, that feature is not being used in this particular data set. Okay, so, in a longer talk, I would sort of write down the whole joint probability and about the beta process. It comes from an underlying so-called Levy process. You can write down the probabilities. You get the ePPF for that. It's called the eFPF, and blah, 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 blah. So we've written papers doing this. And then you do small variance asymptotics. You take a scale parameter to 0 so that you get an optimization functional instead of integrating. Okay, so in a longer talk, I would do that. Just to suffice to say that we get a coordinate descent algorithm out of this on a particular cost function, which is gotten from the overall Bayesian object by small variance asymptotics. Here is that eFPF. There's just some combinatorial expression there that we've worked out. And the likelihood here was a Gaussian of a weighted sum of all your features. So that's a particular choice of likelihood that we've used in this problem. All right, so you do all the math I told you about, and at the end of the day, pops out a least squares problem. You take each feature vector, they have parameters, and that matches the data. This is now just least squares with a trace sitting in front of there, and you get out, again, a sort of a penalty term that's appropriate for this problem. Now, you do coordinate descent in the mu's and in this k, because it appears, again, implicitly here and explicitly here. So this is an algorithm that, as it goes through data, will try to be doing linear regressions on data, but it will try to create new features. It's a dictionary learning kind of procedure. It'll try to create new features as new features seem to be useful for modeling the data. Okay, so this is kind of a hybrid Bayesian frequentist dictionary learning procedure where you don't have to know the number of atoms in your dictionary a priori. Okay, so here's actually the procedure, and I think my very last slide, I'm going to stop here. The marginals of this object, the beta process, is something called the Indian buffet process that was studied by Griffiths and Garamani. They used fully Bayesian Gibbs sampling on this and had a particular little vision problem on that. The total runtime for their Gibbs sampler was 8.5 times 10 to the 3rd seconds. We've implemented a BP means, and the total runtime is 0.36 seconds. Okay, so it's just wildly different. This is just wildly faster. You implement this, you put it in, you hit a button, and it's done. As compared to Gibbs sampling, you hit a button, you go to lunch, and you come back. So I hope that intrigues you. There is now a scalable Bayesian package you can use to design priors for all sorts of interesting structural problems, including Markovian state space problems and so on and so forth. I'm going to quit there. So let me just one last point is that, that's a pretty appealing number, but this is a fairly small toy problem. If we want to now really go to the biggest scale problems that are out there, we're going to start to parallelize, do this distributed, and we have a whole now line of research on parallelization and something called optimistic concurrency control that this paradigm fits very naturally into. And so if you want to follow up with me on that or look at my website, that's one of our most active areas of research right now. Okay, so that's it. I was going to have a second part of the talk, but I'm not going to give that, but just allude to it. There's another unrelated piece of work we've done on streaming distributed asynchronous approach to Bayesian. And again, it's not really Bayesian. It takes the Bayesian inspiration and then heads in a different direction to make it. Streaming is very natural for Bayesians. Distributed asynchronous is not as easy, but there's a way to kind of get there. So let me stop, and I don't know if there's time for questions, but that was the overall picture I was trying to convey, that the Bayesian tools are interesting, they're useful, they're natural, and problems involving states and kinematics and dynamics. And you've already been using them, for all kinds of robot modeling problems. And nonparametrics is something you might want to consider as a next step. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Sure.
Just in case, I'll use this. It's a big room. I love the idea, and I've always loved the idea that Bayes, as you said, takes all the information everywhere and uses it everywhere it can.
Yeah.
You gave 3 examples, and in 2 of them, I'm not sure if I see how that's happening. There were the protein folding ones, which have an angle. Each microscopic piece is an angle in 3 space. And the motion capture, each one is a position in 3 space. And then the pixel one is like, each one is in 128 dimensional pixel space. But the first 2, the global structure is also in 3 space. And in fact, for proteins and people moving around, everything is in 3 space, from the atoms all the way up.
Yeah.
Is that 3-dimensional constraint reflected in the statistics you're talking about?
Yeah, it is. And so it's hard to convey all this easily. If you take that hierarchical Dirichlet process picture where I had kind of multiple branches coming down, at the very top of that was the mother of all atoms. That lives in the same space as all the random measures lives in. You're in the same space all the way up in that hierarchy. What the hierarchy is doing is not putting you in qualitative different problems, it's putting you into different data sets. It's saying that same underlying structure is useful in this data set, and this data set, and this data set. And the power of the data set should be brought together to do inference in every data set. It's a statistical argument, it's not a structural argument.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, let's thank Mike again then.
Thank you.